leak of a decision in progress or a decision that's contemplating being changed to the media. That tends to lead to a destructive cycle where there is negative press and external pressure upon your company. And that tends to get public relations involved. And public relations, by default, tends to err on the side of trying to defend what the company's current stance is and kind of entrenching the company, making it harder to walk back any kind of policy issues that you're trying to change because the company is now sending PR people out defending the old policy. So you really don't want that to happen if you're trying to get change accomplished, as long as you have leaders that are willing to listen to you. So try all the other things first. So it's always better to find out about what's going on early in order to influence it before it actually reaches end users or harms end users. And that way, you don't have the position of even having to walk back anything because you haven't released it publicly, and you can just make it do the right thing immediately on launch. So when you're doing that, it's also important in the spirit of listening to make sure you're listening not just to rationally what people are saying, but also listen to their emotional state. Make sure that you're aware of kind of what feelings people are having, what emotions, where people are kind of getting their gut instincts from, because it's very different trying to persuade someone over their gut instincts versus persuading someone over a logical argument. So the other thing that you can do if you're finding that you as an individual aren't able to get through is you can find other people who share your concerns. Listen, your company may have other people that are posting on social media, whether internal or external. Your company may have mailing lists. Go listen and see who feels similarly to you and reach out to them and say, hey, you know what? I think this effort would work better if we talked together and presented one coherent set of arguments rather than multiple. And in a similar spirit, it's also important to not have too many people talking to decision makers. Because if you have one decision maker who's besieged by 1,000 different people that are trying to persuade them to change what they're doing, they may feel like they're being attacked with torches and pitchforks. And then that causes them to entrench the same way that having external PR pressure on your company will cause your company to entrench. So in the case of resistance to Trump specifically, the neveragain.tech letter, open letter, is a useful starting place because it provides other people that may be at your company that have pledged to resist efforts to discriminate against Muslim people using technology. And if you signed that letter or you're otherwise visible as someone who stands for social justice within your company, listen when other people come to you and say, hey, you know what? I agree. Let's find a way to work on this together. So let's talk about what happens if this doesn't work and you find yourself talking to a brick wall. So in that case, moving to a state of open dissent can be helpful. Employee petitions or open letters can be effective if you are carefully worded with them and very succinct, because you want to make sure in that situation to get as many people in your company behind what you're saying as possible, which means that it has to be easily digestible. People have to understand, what are you upset about? What would you like people to do? And it's a maximum of 3 points in support of what you're trying to do and 1 clear statement of what you would like your company to do. For instance, because of the fact that our company's values include diversity, include fairness, and because of the fact that we have employees that fall into those categories, and because of the fact that our public image would suffer, I urge you to publicly repudiate a Muslim ban, right? Like that is a 3-point one call to action letter. And that makes it a lot easier for people who are potentially signing the letter, as well as anyone who's in the executive team reading that letter, to understand to act on it, because most executives have like a 60-second attention span. So this was actually told to me by a former coworker whom is awesome, and I would not have succeeded in doing employee activism in the past without following this advice. So what happens if you do this, right? Like you post an open letter, you encourage people to sign it, and one point I'll add here is that it is important, if you're doing this, to be aware that there may be some consequences to this, right? Like you are putting your reputation on the line, And if your employer is actively hostile towards open employee discussions, for instance, if your company doesn't have a company-wide all hands where people can ask questions, or your company has a policy of firing people who disagree with the company line, maybe this advice is not for you, but most companies in tech tend to at least claim to listen to their employees and hold all hands like this. So if you start an open letter, and if you offer employees the ability to sign that letter, if you get somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% of the engineering staff at your company to sign a letter saying that they think that a policy is not fair, or that you want the company to do something, it's a very powerful message to the leadership of the company, and they will come to the bargaining table and say, hey, we want to listen to you. Can you as a leader nominate yourself or other people to speak on behalf of your movement and have a discussion? Because in the end, unhappy tech employees are not very creative and are not very productive, and tech employees who leave a company are very expensive to replace. So keeping employees happy is something that executives do in fact care about, as well as caring about listening to the arguments that you have, right? Most executives are willing to admit, hey, you know what? I made an incorrect decision. This decision is actually better for the company. So the reason that I'm advocating doing this is because it's a much lighter weight tool than trying to use organized labor tools such as unionization. So therefore, you can achieve things much faster than you would in terms of trying to gather 30 or 40 or 50% of your company instead of 5% in support of what you're trying to do. And another facet is that you can get some degree of protection, even if you're not trying to unionize, by just including in your letter something about discussing your working conditions, because that is a thing that is protected by the law, and the excellent people at coworker.org have good tools that IBM employees put to use recently. You will notice that they were asking their CEO to publicly recant her open letter to Trump offering IBM support. And they included in there a phrase about increasing 401k contributions. There is a reason for that. So there are ways to protect your speech, even if your company is hostile. However, that doesn't guarantee your company won't retaliate anyway. So be very careful and make sure that you are prepared to deal with fallout if you're working for a hostile company. And finally, I will point out, like I said, engineers are difficult to replace. So if you feel that your company is doing something blatantly illegal or unethical, you can vote for your feet. You can quit. And you can find other employment because of the fact that tech employees are very much in demand. And also, if push comes to shove, you can also whistleblow. Illegal behavior is in fact behavior that should be whistleblown upon. And there are resources for responsibly whistleblowing, right? Like, don't go disclosing the records of journalists, or don't go disclosing the records of activists, right? Talk to a journalist and say, here is the unethical behavior that's happening, not here is a complete data dump of the data in my company. So I think that's a roughly good summary of how to start doing employee organizing within a company and how to achieve results by first figuring out what are you venting about, how do you get to a state of problem solving, figuring out what are the rationales behind what the decision that you're protesting and what are the outcomes that you would want instead, figuring out who to talk to and who to talk to besides that person in case you're getting stonewalled by their administrative assistants, and how to get involved earlier, both in terms of finding out about decisions before they're cast in stone and finding out about other people who are your allies, and finally about how to organize within your own company, publicly within the company. I will add publicly within the company again, right? Like if you have an open letter, in general, to avoid the PR phenomenon, it's important to make sure that that stays within the company and that you don't have it leaked to the point that your press officers are being called by the press about your open letter. Okay, I think that's it. Let's go ahead and go take some questions.
Great. Yeah. So I'm Valerie Aurora. I'm collecting questions over the internet, and the link to the form is now in the description of the talk. So, first question: my company refuses to make a statement because it does a lot of business with the federal government and is worried about loss of work. Any advice for this situation?
It is up to your company's leadership to figure out whether they're willing to accept the potential cost of making that statement. And employee pressure can add to kind of the cost equation of saying, N% of my workforce is going to quit unless we make this statement, or N% of my workforce is going to be unhappy and demoralized unless I make this statement. So that's kind of the cost benefit type of analysis, which is cold, but some executives operate that way and are not concerned about the ethics of what they're doing. So you can kind of appeal to the cost argument of engineers are expensive to replace as well. It's not just contracts that you have to replace. The other thing that you can do if your employer is if your bosses are ethical is to make ethical arguments, right? You can say, I don't think this is right, and the IBM's participation in the Holocaust, for instance, right? That's clearly something that today we look back and we say, that was a terrible, awful thing to do. IBM should never have done that. Do you really want to be remembered as having facilitated that? So I think that that's a useful thing. And kind of adding to the cost and benefit thing, you can point out benefits as well, right? You can say you might lose some government contracts, but you will gain public trust. And people working for privacy-conscious companies might be more willing to hire you because of the fact that you've made that statement. Or you can also attack the cost argument, right? Like you can say, look, the CEO of Google just made a statement in a statement. If Google can do it, and Google does a bunch of business with the government, why can't you, right? So there is safety in numbers. The more you get tech executives, we collectively hold our leadership accountable, the safer and easier it will be for leadership to feel that it is safe for them to make that statement.
Okay, a quick clarifying question. You mentioned that the IBM employees letter included something about 401k contributions. Can you explain why that was included again?
Yes. So I am going to refer you to coworker.org, who has attorneys on their staff. My understanding is that there is some kind of federal protection for people who are working for a company to discuss with their colleagues their working conditions and be free from reprisal from their employer, or at least legally protected in case there is reprisal. So go look up coworker.org and get in contact with their staff, because their staff is the ones who put that IBM letter together.
Excellent. Okay, next question. What do you think of petitions of the form? We want the company to fill in the blank concrete action addressing issue X versus we want the company to develop a policy addressing issue X, a specific solution versus we're asking for some kind of policy. The former is more specific, where the latter is much more likely to happen, but could also fall prey to bureaucratic morass. Advice on that situation?
It depends on the time scale of action that you're looking for. If you're asking the company to make a policy to do something, then that means that you're going to have to spend some time going back and forth over that policy and drafting it and vetting it and getting it approved. Whereas if you want the company